What would you do if a single act of kindness could change your life forever? For Clara Hayes, a 17-year-old waitress struggling to make ends meet, a chance encounter with a hungry little girl set off a chain of events she never expected. But when a mysterious man in a suit walks into her diner with an unbelievable offer, before we dive in, let us know. What time are you listening to this, and where are you? Drop a comment below. We'd love to hear from you. The evening breeze carried the salty tang of the ocean, rustling through the cracked wooden walls of Clara Hayes' home. The small, weather-beaten house stood at the edge of a quiet coastal town in Maine, where the rhythm of the waves was a constant reminder of both serenity and struggle. Inside, the dim light of a single bulb illuminated a cozy but worn living room. Tommy, her 10-year-old brother, sat cross-legged on the floor, his brow furrowed in concentration over his homework. "Tommy, you've got to double-check your math problems. Remember, the teacher said neatness counts," Clara gently reminded him, placing a hand on his curly blonde hair. "Okay, Clara," Tommy replied, his voice soft and obedient. Despite his struggles at school, his earnestness was evident. He looked up at her, his bright blue eyes searching hers for approval. Clara forced a smile. At 17, she had become the anchor of their fragile household after the sudden death of their parents in a car accident 2 years ago. The weight of adulthood pressed heavily on her thin shoulders, but she bore it without complaint, at least not aloud. "Dinner's almost ready," she said, stepping into the kitchen. The cabinets were sparse, holding little more than a few canned goods and a loaf of bread. Clara opened a can of tomato soup and set it on the stovetop, stirring absent-mindedly as her thoughts spiraled. Rent was due in a week, and her last paycheck from the Blue Harbor diner barely covered the utility bills. She glanced at the old refrigerator, where Tommy's crayon drawings were taped in a patchwork of color. Each image, a house with a strong roof, a smiling family, seemed to mock her inability to give him the life he deserved. She clenched the spoon in her hand, willing herself to stay composed. After dinner, Clara helped Tommy into bed, reading him a chapter from his favorite book about astronauts and distant galaxies. His eyelids grew heavy as her soft voice carried him into a dream world far removed from their current reality. "Good night, Tommy," she whispered, brushing a kiss on his forehead. "I love you." "I love you too, Clara," he murmured, his words slurred with sleep. Once his breathing steadied, Clara tiptoed back into the kitchen. She sat at the small table, pulling out a stack of unopened envelopes, bills she couldn't pay. Her hands trembled as she flipped through them, each red stamp screaming, "Past due." Tears pricked at her eyes, but she wiped them away quickly. "I have to keep it together," she whispered to herself, "for Tommy." The moonlight streamed through the cracks in the window frame, casting long shadows on the walls. Alone in the quiet, Clara allowed herself a moment of vulnerability. She buried her face in her hands, the sobs she held back all day finally escaping her lips. The sun rose reluctantly, its golden rays struggling to pierce the heavy gray clouds. Clara's alarm buzzed at 5:30 a.m., dragging her out of a restless sleep. She dressed in her diner uniform, a plain white blouse and a navy apron, then tied her long chestnut-brown hair into a ponytail. In the mirror, her reflection looked older than her years. "Tommy, wake up," she called softly, peeking into his room. He stirred and rubbed his eyes. "Breakfast is ready." Breakfast was simple, toast and the last of the jam. Clara watched Tommy eat, her stomach tight with guilt that she couldn't offer him more. After walking him to the bus stop, she headed to the diner, the brisk sea breeze biting at her cheeks. The Blue Harbor Diner was a small family-owned establishment that had seen better days. The peeling paint on the sign and the flickering neon open light matched the tired expression of its owner, Mildred, a no-nonsense woman in her late 50s. "Morning, Clara," Mildred greeted, handing her a coffee pot. "You've got table 3 in the counter." "Got it," Clara replied, putting on her best customer service smile. The morning rush began, with truck drivers and fishermen filing in for their usual orders. Clara moved swiftly between tables, her mind preoccupied with thoughts of Tommy. She served coffee with practiced ease, balancing plates and smiles despite the ache in her feet. "Clara, don't forget the specials board," Mildred reminded her. "Yes, ma'am," Clara replied, grabbing a piece of chalk to update the board. She noticed her hands trembling slightly but ignored it. When Clara returned home, the house felt colder than usual. Tommy was in his room, drawing spaceships on the back of an old piece of paper. She warmed up leftover soup and joined him at the table. "What's that?" Clara asked, pointing at his drawing. "Our house," Tommy said shyly. "But, like, with a big roof and no holes." Clara's heart twisted. "It's beautiful, Tommy." After tucking him in that night, she sat at the kitchen table once more, staring at the bills. Her fingers traced the edges of an envelope as her mind wandered to what life might have been like if their parents were still alive. The weight of the unknown felt suffocating, but she clenched her fists and whispered to herself, "One day at a time, we'll figure this out." The evening air was crisp, carrying a faint scent of salt and damp earth. Clara stood at the counter of the Blue Harbor Diner, absent-mindedly wiping down the surface as the last few customers trickled out. The bell above the door jingled occasionally, each chime marking another end to a long, uneventful shift. Outside, the streetlights flickered, casting dim pools of light onto the empty sidewalk. "Almost closing time," Mildred called from the back, her raspy voice cutting through the silence. "Don't forget to lock up." "I won't," Clara replied, her voice weary but polite. She glanced at the clock. 9:47 p.m. Just a little longer, and she could head home to Tommy. As Clara began flipping chairs onto tables, her gaze was drawn to the window. A small figure stood outside, partially illuminated by the weak glow of the streetlights. It was a girl, no older than 8, dressed in a thin, oversized hoodie and tattered sneakers. Her face was pale, her wide eyes fixed on the plates of food left behind by the evening diners. Clara's heart clenched. She set down the chair she was holding and stepped closer to the glass. The girl didn't move, her expression both hesitant and hungry. Without hesitation, Clara unlocked the door and opened it, the bell jingling softly. "Hey, sweetie," she said gently. "Are you hungry?" The girl hesitated, taking a small step back, her hands clutching the hem of her hoodie. I don't have any money," she murmured, her voice barely audible. Clara knelt to meet the girl's eye level, her tone soothing. "That's okay. Come on in. It's warm inside." The girl looked around nervously, as if expecting someone to appear and scold her, but eventually she nodded and shuffled inside. Clara guided her to a booth near the corner, away from the windows, and grabbed a menu. "What's your name?" she asked, sitting across from her. "Lily," the girl whispered, her fingers tracing the edge of the table. "Well, Lily, I'm Clara. You can order anything you want. My treat." Lily's eyes widened in disbelief. "Really?" Clara smiled and nodded. "Really." After some gentle encouragement, Lily chose a grilled cheese sandwich and a bowl of tomato soup. Clara placed the order and returned with a glass of water. As they waited, Lily's shoulders visibly relaxed, though her gaze darted around the diner like a wary animal. "Do you live nearby?" Clara asked cautiously, not wanting to overwhelm her. Lily shook her head. "Not really. My mom and we move around a lot." Clara's chest tightened. She didn't need more details to understand what Lily meant. "That sounds tough." "It is," Lily admitted, her voice small. "Sometimes we don't have enough for food. That's why I was looking in the window. I just wanted to see." Clara reached across the table, resting her hand lightly on Lily's. "You're safe here, okay? Eat as much as you need." When the grilled cheese and soup arrived, Lily's face lit up like a child on Christmas morning. She devoured the food quickly but carefully, savoring each bite. Clara watched in silence, her emotions a mixture of sadness and determination. No one should have to go hungry, especially not a child. When Lily finished, she leaned back in the booth, a faint smile on her face. "That was the best thing I've ever eaten," she said softly. Clara chuckled, though her throat felt tight. "I'm glad you liked it." As the girl got up to leave, Clara handed her a small bag with a sandwich and an apple. "For later," she said, smiling. Lily hesitated, then suddenly threw her arms around Clara. The hug was brief but fierce, and when Lily pulled back, her eyes were glistening. "Thank you," she whispered before hurrying out the door and disappearing into the night. Clara locked the door behind Lily, her mind racing. She thought about Tommy, asleep at home, and the way his small shoulders carried the weight of their shared grief. Lily's situation wasn't far removed from their own, and the thought made her stomach twist. "Clara, you coming?" Mildred's voice startled her. The older woman was standing by the back door, her keys jingling. "It's late." "Yeah," Clara said, forcing a smile. "I'm just finishing up." As Mildred left, Clara lingered by the window, staring at the empty street. The encounter with Lily had left a mark on her, a mixture of empathy and helplessness. She couldn't save everyone, but for tonight, she had made a difference for one child. That thought gave her a sliver of peace. The bell above the door jingled suddenly, startling Clara. She turned to see a man entering the diner, his polished black shoes tapping softly against the tiled floor. He was tall, with a sharp suit and a leather briefcase that looked far too expensive for the modest surroundings. His presence immediately filled the room, commanding attention even in its quiet stillness. "Good evening," the man said, his deep voice calm but authoritative. He glanced around the nearly empty diner, his eyes settling on Clara. "Am I too late for a cup of coffee?" Clara hesitated. The close sign was already flipped on the door, but something about the man's demeanor made her nod. "Sure, take a seat," she said, reaching for a clean mug. He chose a corner booth and set his briefcase down, observing the room with a measured gaze. Clara poured him a cup of coffee and placed it in front of him. "Cream or sugar?" she asked. "Black is fine, thank you," he replied, his eyes meeting hers. They were dark, unreadable, but not unkind. "You must be Clara." Clara froze, her hand tightening around the coffee pot. "How do you know my name?" she asked, her voice wary. The man offered a small smile. "I overheard it earlier, when I was here for lunch. You were kind to that little girl tonight. Lily, wasn't it?" Clara's breath caught in her throat. You saw that?" she asked, feeling a mix of embarrassment and confusion. "I did," he said, taking a sip of his coffee. "It was a rare thing to witness. Most people wouldn't have stopped. They would have looked the other way." Clara shifted uncomfortably, not sure how to respond. "It wasn't a big deal," she said, brushing it off. "She was hungry. Anyone would have done the same." "Would they?" he asked, tilting his head slightly. "You don't give yourself enough credit, Miss Hayes." His words unsettled her, not because they were unkind, but because they felt too precise, too knowing. She busied herself by wiping down the counter, trying to shake the unease settling in her chest. The man took another sip of his coffee before setting the mug down carefully. "Allow me to introduce myself," he said, straightening in his seat. "My name is Edward Sterling. I'm in town on business." Clara nodded slowly, still unsure where this was going. "Nice to meet you," she said cautiously. "So, what kind of business?" Edward smiled faintly. "Investments, mostly. I look for opportunities, places where a little help can make a big difference." Clara raised an eyebrow, not following. "And you came to this diner for investments?" "Not quite," Edward replied, his tone shifting slightly. "I came here for dinner, but I stayed longer than planned when I saw you and Lily. It was enlightening." Clara frowned. "I don't understand." Edward leaned forward, his elbows resting on the table. "What I saw tonight wasn't just a simple act of kindness. It was a glimpse into who you are, a young woman carrying more responsibility than most adults twice her age, yet still finding the strength to care for a stranger." Clara's throat tightened. She didn't like the feeling of being analyzed, but she couldn't deny the truth in his words. Edward continued, his voice softer now. "I believe in helping people who help others, and I think you're someone worth helping." Clara blinked, stunned by the unexpected turn in the conversation. "What are you saying?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm saying I'd like to help you," Edward replied. "Financially, professionally, whatever it takes to make your life a little easier." Clara shook her head, stepping back from the booth. "I don't need charity," she said quickly, her tone defensive. "We're managing just fine." Edward's gaze didn't waver. "I'm not offering charity, Clara. I'm offering an opportunity." She crossed her arms, her heart pounding. "Why? Why would you do that for someone you don't even know?" Edward leaned back slightly, his expression unreadable. "Because I see potential in you. Potential that shouldn't be wasted." Clara stared at him, her thoughts racing. She didn't trust him. Not yet. But there was something in his tone, his conviction, that made her hesitate. She thought of Tommy, of their tiny house with its leaking roof and creaking floors, of the mounting bills and the sleepless nights spent wondering how to make it all work. I don't know, she stammered. I need to think about it. Of course, Edward said, rising to his feet. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a sleek business card, placing it on the table. Take your time. My contact information is here. Call me if you're interested. Clara stared at the card, her fingers itching to pick it up. She didn't look at him as he headed for the door, the sound of his polished shoes fading into the night. When the bell jingled one last time, she finally exhaled, her knees feeling weak. The business card a stark reminder of the stranger's words. Her act of kindness toward Lily has set something in motion, but whether it will be a blessing or a burden remains unclear. The sun rose reluctantly over the coastal town, its weak rays struggling to cut through the dense morning fog. Clara sat at the small kitchen table, staring at the sleek business card Edward Sterling had left the night before. The polished black print seemed out of place against the worn wood of the table and the chipped mug of coffee beside it. "Clara, what's that?" Tommy's voice broke the silence. He was rubbing sleep from his eyes, his small frame dwarfed by the oversized hoodie he wore, one of their father's old ones. "It's nothing," Clara said quickly, slipping the card into her pocket. "Just something from work." Tommy tilted his head, unconvinced but too tired to press the issue. Clara smiled at him, ruffling his hair. "Go get ready for school. Breakfast will be ready in a minute." As Tommy shuffled off, Clara took a deep breath and leaned back in her chair. Edward's words from the night before echoed in her mind. "I'm offering an opportunity." That evening, the Blue Harbor Diner hummed with its usual rhythm. Truck drivers occupied booths, chatting loudly, while fishermen crowded the counter, nursing cups of black coffee. Clara moved through the room with practiced ease, her tray balanced with plates of food. She was clearing a table near the window when she heard the unmistakable sound of the doorbell. She glanced up and froze. Edward Sterling had returned, his polished shoes and tailored suit once again starkly contrasting with the diner's rustic interior. "Good evening, Clara," Edward greeted, his voice smooth as he approached the counter. Clara hesitated, her stomach knotting with a mixture of nervousness and curiosity. "Evening," she replied, forcing a smile. "Back for more coffee?" "Not tonight," he said with a small smile. "I was hoping we could talk, if you have a moment." Mildred, who had been watching the interaction from the kitchen, emerged with a curious expression. "Clara, why don't you take your break now? I can handle things for a bit." Clara shot her a grateful look before gesturing for Edward to follow her to a quiet booth near the back. She sat down across from him, her hands resting in her lap as she tried to mask her apprehension. Edward leaned forward, his elbows resting on the table. "I know this must feel overwhelming," he began, his tone gentle. "But I meant what I said last night. I want to help you." Clara crossed her arms defensively. "You still haven't told me why," she said. "What's in it for you?" Edward paused, studying her with an intensity that made her shift in her seat. "When I was younger, I grew up in a situation not too different from yours," he admitted. "It wasn't easy, but there were people along the way who believed in me, who gave me chances I didn't think I deserved. Without them, I wouldn't be where I am today. This is my way of paying it forward." Clara blinked, surprised by his honesty. "So, you just go around helping strangers?" "Not strangers," Edward corrected. "People I see potential in. People like you." Clara frowned, unsure how to respond. Edward reached into his briefcase and pulled out a folder, sliding it across the table to her. "I've done my research," he said. "This town has no bakery or coffee shop. There's an empty storefront 2 blocks from here that's perfect for one. I want to help you open it." Clara stared at the folder, her mind racing. "A bakery?" she echoed, her voice filled with disbelief. "Why would you think I'd be good at that?" "I heard your co-workers talking about the pies you make for staff dinners," Edward said, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "They swear they're the best in town." Her cheeks flushed. Baking had always been a hobby, something she did to unwind after long shifts. She'd never thought of it as anything more than that. "This is crazy," Clara said, shaking her head. "I don't have the money, the experience, any of it." "That's where I come in," Edward said simply. "I'll cover the startup costs, help you with licensing, marketing, everything. You'll pay me back when the business becomes profitable." Clara hesitated, her mind a whirlwind of doubts. "And if it doesn't?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Edward leaned back, his expression calm but firm. "Then, we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. But I have faith in you, Clara. You're resilient, resourceful, and hard-working. I've seen it." Clara bit her lip, her heart pounding. She thought of Tommy, of the bills piling up at home, of the way Lily's eyes had lit up after that warm meal. This could be her chance, not just to survive, but to build a better life for her and Tommy. "I need time to think," she said finally. Edward nodded. "Take all the time you need," he said, standing. He placed a second business card on the table. "When you're ready, call me." After Edward left, Clara sat alone in the booth, staring at the folder in front of her. She flipped it open, her eyes scanning the detailed business plan inside. It was meticulous, outlining everything from projected expenses to marketing strategies. It was real. It was possible. Her thoughts were interrupted by Mildred, who slid into the seat across from her. "So, what's the story with the fancy guy?" she asked, her tone curious but not unkind. Clara sighed, closing the folder. "He wants to help me open a bakery," she said. "He thinks I can do it." Mildred raised an eyebrow. "And what do you think?" Clara hesitated, her fingers tracing the edge of the folder. "I don't know. It sounds too good to be true." Mildred leaned back, crossing her arms. "Well, if there's one thing I've learned in life, it's that sometimes you have to take a leap of faith. Just make sure you're leaping with your eyes open." Clara nodded, her heart heavy with uncertainty. She didn't know if she could trust Edward or herself. But for the first time in years, she felt the faint stirrings of hope. The following morning, Clara sat at the kitchen table, the weight of Edward's proposal pressing heavily on her mind. The folder from the night before lay unopened beside her cup of coffee. Tommy was busy drawing rockets on the back of an old flyer, his concentration unwavering. She glanced at him, her heart swelling with both love and worry. This wasn't just about her anymore. It never had been. Her gaze drifted to the small, weathered window above the sink, where the sunlight filtered through a thin curtain. The light seemed to symbolize the sliver of hope Edward's offer had given her. Taking a deep breath, she pulled out her phone and dialed the number on his card. 2 days later, Clara stood outside a modest storefront in the heart of the town's small commercial district. The faded sign above the door read, "For lease," and the windows were covered in dust and old tape marks. Edward greeted her with a warm smile, dressed impeccably as always, and beside him stood a younger man with a clipboard in hand. "Clara, good to see you," Edward said, extending his hand. "I'd like you to meet Ryan Moore. He's the contractor and designer I've hired to help bring this place to life." Ryan turned, his green eyes lighting up as he smiled at Clara. He was in his early 20s, with a relaxed demeanor that contrasted sharply with Edward's polished professionalism. His tousled brown hair and slightly wrinkled shirt gave him an approachable charm. "Hey, Clara," Ryan said, his voice warm. "Edward's told me about your vision. I'm excited to help you make it happen." "My vision?" Clara asked, glancing at Edward with a raised eyebrow. Edward chuckled softly. "Perhaps I'm getting ahead of myself, but I believe you'll find Ryan's expertise invaluable." They stepped inside the dusty, neglected storefront. The wooden floors creaked under their feet, and the faint smell of mildew lingered in the air. Clara's stomach churned with doubt. "Don't let the mess fool you," Ryan said, noticing her hesitation. "This place has good bones. With a little work, it'll be perfect." He walked her through the space, gesturing as he spoke. "We can set up a display case here by the window, a seating area over there, and maybe a small coffee bar in the corner. It'll feel warm and inviting, like home." Clara nodded slowly, trying to picture the transformation. Despite her nerves, Ryan's enthusiasm was infectious. For the first time, she began to see the potential Edward had spoken of. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of activity. Clara spent her mornings at the diner, her afternoons at the storefront, and her evenings helping Tommy with his homework. Ryan became a constant presence, his easygoing nature making the long hours feel less daunting. "Pass me that hammer, would you?" Ryan asked one afternoon as they worked side by side on the display shelves. Clara handed it to him, watching as he skillfully nailed the wood into place. "You've done this before," she remarked. "Plenty of times," he replied with a grin. "My dad's a carpenter. I grew up helping him with projects like this." Clara smiled, feeling a small flicker of connection. Must be nice, having that kind of bond. Ryan hesitated, his grin fading slightly. Yeah, it was. He passed away a few years ago, though. I'm sorry, Clara said softly, her chest tightening with empathy. Ryan shrugged, his expression bittersweet. It's okay. He taught me a lot. How to build things, how to fix what's broken. I think he'd like this project. It's not just about the work. It's about creating something meaningful. Clara nodded, his words resonating with her own journey. That's what I want this place to be, she said. Not just a bakery, but a place where people feel safe, like they belong. Ryan glanced at her, a flicker of admiration in his eyes. You're doing something incredible, Clara. Don't forget that. As the days turned into weeks, Clara and Ryan's bond grew stronger. He was patient with her questions, supportive when she doubted herself, and always willing to go the extra mile to make the space perfect. He even helped Tommy fix his old bike, earning the boys' instant approval. You're pretty cool, Tommy declared one afternoon, watching Ryan tighten the bike's chain. Ryan laughed. Thanks, buddy. You're not so bad yourself. Clara stood in the doorway, watching them with a warmth she hadn't felt in a long time. For the first time, she allowed herself to imagine a future where things were better, where Tommy could thrive, and she could breathe a little easier. Not everyone in the town shared Clara's excitement. Rumors began to spread, fueled by curiosity and suspicion. Some neighbors whispered that Edward's generosity must come with strings attached, while others speculated about Clara's relationship with Ryan. People will talk, Mildred warned one evening at the diner. But don't let it get to you, Clara. They don't see the bigger picture. Clara nodded, though the weight of the judgment pressed heavily on her. She tried to focus on the work, pouring her energy into the bakery and trusting that her actions would speak louder than words. The soft hum of anticipation filled the air as Clara stood in the center of the bakery, her heart pounding with a mixture of pride and anxiety. The newly installed sign above the door read, "The Coastal Crust Bakes and Brews." Warm light from the storefront spilled onto the street outside, illuminating the rows of freshly cleaned windows and inviting passers-by to peek inside. It was opening day. Ryan was beside her, adjusting a shelf filled with jars of homemade cookies, his usual cheerful demeanor helping to ground her nerves. You ready for this? He asked, glancing at her with an encouraging smile. Clara took a deep breath, smoothing her apron. I think so, she replied, though her voice trembled slightly. She looked around the room, taking in the polished wood floors, the cozy seating area near the window, and the glass display case brimming with pies, pastries, and fresh bread. It was everything she'd hoped it would be, and more. Don't worry, Ryan said, nudging her lightly. You've got this. Clara smiled weakly. She wasn't so sure. The first customers trickled in as the morning sun rose higher in the sky. By mid-morning, the bakery was bustling with activity. Locals and out-of-towners alike lined up to try Clara's baked goods, the aroma of cinnamon rolls and fresh coffee drawing them in like moths to a flame. Can I get 2 slices of apple pie and a latte? An older woman asked, her smile warm as she handed Clara a crisp bill. Coming right up, Clara replied, her hands moving swiftly to fill the order. The rhythm of serving customers felt familiar, but the stakes were higher now. Every sale mattered. Tommy had insisted on helping, proudly donning a miniature apron as he carried pastries to tables and greeted customers with a shy but cheerful, "Welcome to the Coastal Crust." His enthusiasm drew smiles from even the most stoic patrons. Clara caught Ryan's eye across the room. He gave her a thumbs up, his expression full of pride. For a moment, she allowed herself to believe that everything was going to be okay. Just after noon, as the lunch crowd swelled, the door to the bakery swung open with a loud creak. Clara looked up from the counter to see a delivery driver standing in the doorway, a clipboard in hand. "Delivery for Hayes," the man announced, his tone brisk. Clara frowned. "Delivery? I didn't order anything for today." The driver shrugged, gesturing toward the large crate behind him. "Says right here, 2 cases of flour and 3 cases of sugar." Her stomach sank. The bakery's small storage area was already stocked, and she hadn't budgeted for extra supplies this week. She stepped around the counter, her pulse quickening. "Can you double-check the name?" she asked, hoping it was a mistake. The driver scanned his clipboard. "Nope, it's for you." Clara bit her lip, unsure of what to do. Just then, Ryan appeared at her side. "What's going on?" he asked, his brow furrowed. Clara explained the situation, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't order this, Ryan. I can't afford it." Ryan glanced at the delivery slip, his expression thoughtful. "Could it be from Edward? Maybe he sent it as a surprise." Clara hesitated, unsure whether to feel relieved or frustrated. She didn't want to rely on Edward more than necessary. "Maybe, but I should call and check." Before Clara could address the delivery, Tommy appeared at her side, tugging on her sleeve. His face was pale, and he clutched his stomach. "Clara, I don't feel so good," he mumbled, his voice weak. Clara's heart skipped a beat. She knelt down, placing a hand on his forehead. He was burning up. "Ryan, can you handle things here for a bit?" she asked, her voice tight with worry. Ryan nodded without hesitation. "Go. I've got this." Clara scooped Tommy into her arms and hurried out the door, the bustling bakery fading behind her as she made her way to the nearest clinic. The weight of his small body in her arms felt heavier than ever. Hours later, Clara returned to the bakery, exhausted but relieved. Tommy had been diagnosed with a stomach virus. Nothing serious, but enough to keep him out of school for a few days. She found Ryan still behind the counter, managing the bakery like a seasoned professional. "Everything okay?" he asked as she stepped inside. Clara nodded, her eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you, Ryan. I don't know what I would have done without you." "Don't mention it," he said, brushing off her thanks with a casual wave. "That's what partners are for, right?" Clara blinked, taken aback by his choice of words. "Partners?" Ryan shrugged, a faint blush creeping up his neck. "Well, yeah, I mean, we're in this together, aren't we?" A small smile tugged at Clara's lips. "Yeah, I guess we are." As the sun dipped below the horizon, Clara sat on the bakery's front steps, her legs stretched out in front of her. Ryan joined her, a cup of coffee in hand. The two sat in comfortable silence, the faint hum of the town settling around them. "You did good today," Ryan said finally, breaking the quiet. Even with everything that happened, Clara let out a soft laugh. "It didn't feel that way." Ryan looked at her, his expression earnest. "It never does when you're in the middle of it. But trust me, Clara, you're doing something amazing here." She turned to him, her heart swelling with an unfamiliar warmth. "Thank you, Ryan, for everything." Their eyes met, and for a brief moment, the weight of the day melted away. Clara felt a flicker of something she hadn't dared to feel in years. Hope. The following weeks brought a whirlwind of change to Clara's life. Word about the coastal crust spread quickly, and the bakery became the town's new favorite spot. Mornings buzzed with the chatter of locals savoring fresh coffee and pastries, while afternoons saw tourists stopping by for a slice of Clara's now famous apple pie. The once empty storefront was alive with warmth and laughter, a beacon of hope in the small coastal town. For Clara, the bakery wasn't just a business, it was a lifeline. It gave her a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in years, and more importantly, a way to provide for Tommy. One quiet evening, as Clara tidied up after a particularly busy day, the soft jingling of the doorbell caught her off guard. She looked up from wiping the counter, her tired eyes widening as she recognized the two figures standing in the doorway. It was Lily and her mother. Clara froze, the cleaning rag slipping from her hand. A wave of emotion surged through her. Relief, surprise, and an overwhelming sense of joy. Lily looked different. Her once gaunt face was now fuller, her cheeks touched with a healthy glow. Her clothes, while simple, were clean and neatly pressed. Her mother stood tall beside her, her posture more confident, though the lines of hardship still etched her features. "Hi, Clara," Lily said shyly, her small hand clutching her mother's tightly. "Lily!" Clara exclaimed, her voice brimming with warmth and disbelief. She quickly stepped out from behind the counter, her heart pounding. "How are you? It's so good to see you." Lily's mother offered a soft smile, her voice steady but thick with gratitude. "We're doing better," she said, her eyes glistening. "And it's all because of you." Clara immediately shook her head, her hands waving dismissively. "No," she said, her tone firm but kind. "I didn't do anything special." But Lily's mother stepped forward, her gaze steady and unwavering. "Yes, you did," she said, her voice trembling slightly. You showed us kindness when we needed it most. That night, it gave us something we hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. And that hope kept us going. Clara swallowed hard, her throat tightening as her chest swelled with emotion. She knelt down to Lily's height, her eyes meeting the little girl's. "I'm so glad you are okay," she said, her voice soft, almost a whisper. Lily gave a small smile, her tiny frame radiating quiet strength. "We are," she replied, her voice small but firm. "Thank you." Unable to find the right words, Clara gently pulled Lily into a hug. She held her tightly, her heart full as the weight of what this moment truly meant settled over her. When Lily pulled back, her shy smile returned, and her mother gently placed a hand on Clara's shoulder. "You reminded us that there's still good in this world," Lily's mother said. "That means everything." As the two turned to leave, Clara walked them to the door, her steps feeling lighter than they had in months. The next day, Clara set up a donation jar on the counter labeled, "For Kids Like Lily." She decided to dedicate a portion of her profits to helping children and families in need. Customers were quick to notice, many dropping spare change or a few bills into the jar without hesitation. As the bakery flourished, Clara and Ryan's relationship deepened. They often found themselves working late into the night, sharing stories and laughter as they cleaned up or prepared for the next day. One evening, after a particularly grueling shift, Ryan leaned against the counter, a playful smirk on his face. "You know, I've never met anyone who works harder than you," Clara chuckled, wiping her hands on her apron. "You must not get out much." "I'm serious," Ryan insisted, his tone softening. "What you've built here, it's incredible. And the way you take care of Tommy, it's inspiring." Clara looked away, her cheeks flushing. "I'm just doing what anyone would do." Ryan stepped closer, his voice gentle. "No, Clara, not everyone would. That's what makes you special." Their eyes met, and for a moment the world seemed to stand still. Clara felt her heart skip a beat, her walls beginning to crack under the weight of his sincerity. But before she could respond, the sound of Tommy calling from the back broke the spell. "Clara, can you help me with my science project?" he shouted, his voice muffled but eager. Clara smiled apologetically. "Duty calls," Ryan grinned, stepping back. "Go be the best big sister ever. I'll lock up." Despite the bakery's success, not everyone in the town was supportive. Whispers circulated, accusing Clara of taking advantage of Edward's generosity or questioning her relationship with Ryan. The rumors reached their peak one morning when Clara overheard two women talking as they waited in line. "I'm just saying, it's strange," one of them murmured. "A man like Edward doesn't just throw money at someone for nothing." "And what about that contractor?" the other added. "You think there's something going on there?" Clara's hands clenched into fists, her stomach twisting with anger and hurt. She tried to focus on the customer in front of her, but the words lingered, a dark cloud over her otherwise bright day. Later that evening, Ryan found her sitting on the steps outside the bakery, her shoulders slumped. He sat down beside her, his expression filled with concern. "Rough day?" he asked. Clara nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "People are talking?" Ryan sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Small towns," he said simply. "Everyone has an opinion." "It's not fair," Clara said, her voice cracking. "They don't know what I've been through, what we've been through." Ryan placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You don't have to explain yourself to anyone. The people who matter see the truth." Clara looked at him, her eyes brimming with tears. "Thank you, Ryan, for always being here." "Always," he said softly. The bakery hummed with life, filled with the laughter of children and the soft murmur of conversations. It was a crisp autumn evening, and the Coastal Crust was hosting its first ever community appreciation night. Clara had decided to celebrate the bakery's success by inviting the entire town to a special gathering, complete with free samples, live music, and warm cider. Clara stood near the counter, her heart swelling as she watched Tommy play with a group of children near the seating area. His laughter echoed through the room, carefree and joyous, a sound she hadn't heard often enough in recent years. "Looks like he's having a blast," Ryan said, appearing beside her with 2 cups of cider. Clara smiled, accepting one of the cups. "He deserves it," she said softly. "We both do." Ryan nodded, his expression warm. "And so do you." As the evening progressed, Edward Sterling arrived, his usual polished demeanor softened by the relaxed atmosphere. He greeted Clara with a smile and raised his glass of cider in a silent toast. "Do you mind if I say a few words?" Edward asked, gesturing toward the small stage set up near the back. Clara hesitated for a moment before nodding. "Of course." The room quieted as Edward stepped onto the stage. He cleared his throat, his commanding presence instantly drawing everyone's attention. "Thank you all for coming tonight," he began, his voice steady and warm. "I've had the privilege of watching Clara's journey over the past few months, and I can say without hesitation that this bakery is more than just a business. It's a symbol of resilience, kindness, and the power of community." Clara felt her cheeks flush as the crowd turned to look at her. She ducked her head, sipping her cider to hide her embarrassment. Edward continued, his tone growing more personal. "When I was young, I knew what it felt like to struggle. My family didn't have much, and there were days when we weren't sure how we'd make it to the next. But someone believed in me, just as I believed in Clara. And look what she's done with that belief." The room erupted into applause, and Clara felt Ryan's hand rest lightly on her back. She looked up at him, her eyes brimming with gratitude. After the applause died down, Edward approached Clara, a thoughtful expression on his face. "I hope you don't mind me putting you in the spotlight," he said, his tone light. Clara shook her head. "I'm just not used to it, that's all." "You'd better get used to it," Edward replied with a smile. "This is only the beginning." As they talked, Lily and her mother approached, their smiles lighting up the room. "Clara," Lily's mother said, her voice filled with emotion, "we wanted to thank you again for everything." Clara knelt down, hugging Lily tightly. "You don't have to thank me," she said softly. "Just promise me you'll keep smiling." Lily nodded, her small arms wrapping around Clara's neck. "I will." Later that night, after the crowd had thinned and the bakery was quiet again, Clara found herself sitting on the front steps with Ryan, the cool night air wrapped around them, and the distant sound of waves crashing against the shore added to the peaceful atmosphere. "You did it," Ryan said, breaking the silence. "You turned a dream into reality." Clara smiled, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "I couldn't have done it without you." Ryan turned to her, his expression serious. "You could have, but I'm glad you let me be a part of it." Their eyes met, and for a moment Clara felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the cider or the night's success. She reached out, her hand brushing his. "Ryan, Before she could finish, Ryan gently took her hand in his voice low. "You don't have to say anything, Clara. I just want you to know I'm here. Always." Clara's heart swelled, and for the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to hope, not just for the bakery, but for something more. The evening ended with Clara, Tommy, Ryan, and a few lingering friends sharing stories and laughter in the glow of the bakery's lights. Edward had quietly slipped away, leaving a note on the counter that read, "The best is yet to come." As Clara closed the door that night, she looked around the empty bakery and felt a deep sense of gratitude. The journey had been anything but easy, but it had brought her here, to a place of hope, love, and possibility. The next evening, Clara and Ryan sat together on the bench outside the bakery, watching the sun dip below the horizon. Tommy played nearby, his laughter blending with the sound of the waves. Ryan reached over, taking Clara's hand in his. She turned to him, her smile soft and genuine. "It feels like a dream," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's real," Ryan replied, "and it's just the beginning." As the sun disappeared, leaving a trail of golden light across the sky, Clara leaned into Ryan's shoulder, her heart full. For the first time in years, she wasn't just surviving, she was living. Thank you for joining me for this story. I invite you to share your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed the video, please consider subscribing to the channel to stay updated on the heartfelt stories I'm passionate about sharing. Your support means the world to me and motivates me to keep creating. I'm truly grateful to have you on this journey with me.